Hello everybody. Today we are going to work on a brand new starter solution where we're going to build a more complex component. We are going to kick it up a notch in this series of lessons where we're going to create what's called a sortable component using the same sort of functionality and the same sort of patterns that we have learned throughout the duration of this course. This is going to be very similar in setup, but we're going to kind of start from scratch and go back to basics and try to implement this idea of a sortable. So just as always, when we start with a new starter solution, you can click on the link in the video description to download that starter solution. It's going to give you a zip file, which you can unzip. You can rename that folder or change into the folder as it's named, whatever you want to do. And you're going to see very similarly to what I have here in the terminal. If you change into that directory, you'll see some files in there. We're going to run, as always, an npm install to go ahead and install our npm package dependencies. And now that that is done, let's open this up inside of Visual Studio Code using the code space dot, where we can see our solution. And simultaneously, I'm going to go ahead and run an npm run start to boot this up inside of our default web browser, which you can see gives us our starting sortable solution. And I fooled you. You almost thought this wasn't going to be about food, didn't you? But in fact, it is involving food. We have tacos, burritos, pizza, etc. But basically, you can see it's a pretty simple app to begin with. We have this heading that says rank your favorite food. We have an unordered or a bulleted list that has a bunch of foods in it. And then we have a box for JSON, which we'll wire up later on in the lesson. But the idea is that we're going to create a sortable component. And if you've never seen a sortable before, basically what it is it's some sort of component that allows you to reorder items in a list. So in this case, we have this idea of ranking our favorite food. So if I really like hamburgers, I should be able to grab it, drag it up to the top and drop it to allow me to reorder the items in this list. And this is a lot more complex than the toggles we've worked on thus far in the series, mostly because we're introducing this idea of drag and drop events. And that's going to be a lot more complex in its implementation, but don't worry. It's actually not going to be too bad because we've kind of been doing the Karate Kid thing where this whole series I've had you guys wax on and wax off. And now you're going to realize that you know karate and you know exactly how to do these sortables. We're just going to apply the same stuff we've been doing to this component that we're going to build here. So I think that's going to be fun. So let's start by taking a look at the solution inside of Visual Studio Code so we can familiarize ourselves with what it is that we're working with. We have, as always, our source folder, which contains all the stuff we need to worry about. We have an index.html file, which is loading in app.sass. So that's in the Sass folder and app.sass, which you can see is pretty simple to start with. So we have our normal config file. We have a sortable Sass file, which is right here. This is going to be where we do most of our CSS work in this lesson. And you can see it's empty to start with, just a comment at the top there. And there's also this file called JSON. It's basically, I don't even think we need to edit this, but it's just to style up this text area down here, which we're going to use a little bit later on. I don't even think we're going to get into it in this lesson, but we're going to wire that up so that we can basically see how we can get the sortable data from our sortable component here as like a JSON object or maybe a JavaScript array. I don't know how we're going to do that just yet, but that is a common thing you may want to do with a sortable is you may want to say, okay, now that the user has dropped an item, give me the data so I can store it in a database or I can save it to my other JavaScript object or whatever. You can do whatever you want with it at that point. But we'll do that a little bit later on. And then, so we're mostly focused on this sortable thing for now. And then also in the index.html file, you have a navbar as always. We have our main page area, which contains the sortable HTML. And this is actually pretty simple to get started. We have an H3, a heading that says rank your favorite food. And then we have a div with a class of sortable. That's, you can consider that the container for this component that we are building. And then an unordered list with list items. And that's pretty simple to get started, right? It's literally just an unordered list to begin with. We have our JSON box down here. That's just a text area that I've marked as read only, so you can't actually change it. And then finally, we're loading in our app .js at the very bottom, which you'll notice is an empty file. So we will work on this in a bit as well, but mostly we're going to be focused on doing a little bit of styling to begin with, because first of all, I want to kind of take out the presentation of what you would normally expect from like a bulleted list, an unordered list in our HTML. And we'll kind of restyle this to make it obvious to users that the intention here is we want the users to be able to reorder this. We want them to be able to grab items, move them up and down. And without doing any scripting just yet, let's just kind of update the style to make sure it looks as if it is a sortable component. Okay, so in order to do that, what we're going to do is inside of our sortable.sass file, we're going to override some styles on this list over here. So if you remember, we had a container called sortable, and all of our HTML is going to be inside of that. So first of all, let's just add a border to that, 1 pixel solid lighter. So that's just going to give us a little border around the sortable itself. That's pretty simple. And then also, let's say whenever you have an unordered list inside of a .sortable container, let's take away the bulleted list styling. So that's a pretty, you could have a utility class that does this. That's usually what I do, like an unlist class or a remove list or something like that. But it's just 3 styles. You need to take away the default styles from an unordered bulleted list. So it's just margin 0, padding 0, padding 0, and list style none. So just by adding those 3 styles, you see it basically just goes back to almost like each list item is its own div. It's just block elements inside of an unordered list block element. And then for each list item that's inside of that unordered list, let's give them some padding so they're not so squishy, so squished together, if you will. So kind of pad those out to give them some nice padding, something like 8 on the top and bottom and 12 on the left and right. I think that's going to look good. And then I want to give a border between them. So whenever we have 2 LIs next to each other, we will add a border top of 1 pixel solid lighter. So that gives a little divider between each one. It's real subtle, might even be kind of hard to see there, but I don't want to be too overt. I just kind of want to give the impression that, hey, these are individual items. They kind of look like they're stacked on top of each other now, which I think that's important with a sortable, is you want to give this idea of having layers that are stacked on top of each other, because we're eventually going to want to be able to pick up one of those layers and kind of move it around. So they should look like their own sort of separate element, but they are connected to all the others. So it's like layers in a cake, and you can pick up a layer and move it up and down. And that's the idea. That's kind of sort of the intention of why we want to give them a little bit of a subtle border. And also, because we have a little bit of a scroll bar here, maybe we will actually go into this JSON, and let's just change the height of this to like, it has a height on here that was set to 250. I'm just going to bring that down to 200 so that we don't have that ugly scroll bar on the screen there. I think that looks a little bit better. Now, another thing that I think is really important with a sortable is you need to have some sort of indication of like what I would call a handle, something that looks like you could grab it and like grab that item and pick it up and move it around. And that's very typical of sortable components you'll see in other libraries that you may find. And we could certainly do this through kind of like what we did with the menu icon, where we create our own CSS icons just using spans and divs and stuff like that. But to be honest, at this point, I think we're getting a little more advanced, so I want to focus less on creating our own icons, and let's just find an icon we can drop in here. So we're actually going to use Font Awesome. And if you've never used this, it's a pretty cool icon font library that you can basically just drop into your solution, and you get a whole library of icons you could use in your app, which is very, very handy. So for example, if we hit start using free, you'll see they give you a style sheet link. So let's just click on the copy button over here, and we will drop that into the top of our HTML file. So we get our style sheet link there. And then now that we have that, we can use any of the icons in here. So for example, if I want to search for a grab icon, that one, you can see they have all sorts of grip lines, or I guess grip would be a good thing to search for. They have these grips that you can basically add to your HTML. And if we pick one of these, like for example, if I decide, hey, I want these horizontal grip lines, let's just come in here. It shows you the icon, and we can just simply click on this HTML up here to copy it. And inside of our HTML file, we can now add a grip icon anywhere we want. And by adding that to each one of our list items here, you'll notice now inside the HTML, we get a little icon there. How easy was that? Font Awesome is really, really cool. Definitely highly recommend it if you need to quickly drop some icons in there. There's also some other libraries that are really good, like Material Icons by Google, and it's all very, very cool. And they have a pro version, but you can certainly use the free icons whenever you are working here. So there's all those grip icons, like I mentioned, that are good for sortables. You can even filter by free over here. So you can see those various grip icons work really well. There's also a sort icon. This one works well as well. So you could just simply change your HTML to FA sort. So that would be as easy as just grabbing all these guys and changing that to sort. And you'll see there that kind of updates the style there as well. And I actually think in this case, because it is a vertical sortable, we're actually dragging things up and down, that might work a little bit better in this case. So let's go ahead and leave that sort icon. It's generally a good idea with your icons because they're really only visual in nature to set aria hidden equals true, because you don't want a screen reader trying to describe what that is to users, because in this case, it's really just a visual decoration, if you will. And with that icon in place, we can use this FAS class that's on all of our icons there, or even just the I selector here. So that inside of our sortable CSS, we can say when you have an icon or an I element inside of a sortable, let's bring the color down to like a light color to make it a little more subtle. So you can see that over there. Let's set the font size to a little bit smaller. I think that might look a little nicer. Font size 12 pixels. I want to give a little more spacing between the label and the icon itself, so we can add a margin right of like 4 pixels, something like that. And if you're a normal person, you're probably done, but I'm certainly not normal. So I'm thinking that if you look at this really closely, it looks like the vertical alignment of that is a little too low. Like I would want to bump this up ever so slightly. And because I'm super particular, we could do like something like position relative top -1 pixels. It's so subtle, but it just bumped it up 1 pixel on the y-axis, and I think that looks so much better. Certainly not required, definitely not something you have to do there, but I think that's looking pretty good at this point. And I would say that we could even have a hover style on our list items. So when you hover over a list item, and then you have an icon inside of there, we can set the color to like a primary. And then this will give a really good indication on hover. You can see how it turns green on the left, which one, even if you're over here and the label's really far away, you get a nice little indicator as to which one you're ready to pick up and grab. We could even set a transition on this if we wanted. Transition, not transform, transition, color, ease, like so. And then that'll give us a little bit of a transition there. We could even add a little transform on that too. Let's add a transform ease, like so. And then whenever you hover over this, let's transform scale it up a little bit. Make it a little bigger when you hover over. I think that looks pretty good. So it kind of pops out at you, maybe even like 1.5. Kind of pops out at you whenever you hover over it. I think that looks pretty good. Cool. Okay, and finally, I think the biggest indicator to users that this is a sortable element, in addition to having an icon that sort of shows like, hey, this is a handle, you can pick it up and grab it and move this thing around. Another really important thing is the cursor, because generally with a sortable, you would want to have some sort of cursor that indicates that you can pick up and grab something. So, and this is kind of typical with any sort of drag and drop functionality, not necessarily just a sortable, is we want to enforce this idea of, hey, you can pick things up and grab them inside of this sortable. So we could very simply, in the sortable, we could add a cursor to the unordered list. So anytime your cursor is over that unordered list, we can set the cursor to, there's one called grab. And you'll see what that does is it kind of turns into this grabby hand, if you will, when you hover over that. And then later when we implement the actual drag and drop, we can make it so that whenever you actually grab, there's a grabbing cursor, so it'll turn into like a closed hand. So it looks like you're opening your hand and then you're grabbing it using that cursor. I think that's a really important interaction to really enforce to the user as well. Cool. So I think that's going to do it for our initial styles here for our sortable. And now the task becomes, how do we actually make these elements draggable? And the cool thing is, in modern HTML, this is not something we always had, but basically all you have to do is on your list items, if I add a cursor to each one of our list items here, I can simply add draggable equals true. And then check out what this does. Now that that's draggable true, I can actually pick those up, and you see it creates a little ghost, if you will, like when I pick them up, and it's not doing anything because you have to use JavaScript to determine what happens when you drag. So like when you drop on something, you need to use JavaScript event listeners. So just like we use click listeners and key down listeners in the past and previous lessons, we have to use listeners to say, when you drag over something, do this. Or when you drop on something, when your drag ends, then you need to do this. So just by making something draggable, the browser is going to create this cool functionality where it does this ghosting, and it looks like you can kind of moving things around, but inherently you can't do anything with that. There's only a couple of things that allow you to actually do something when you drag by default. For example, I don't know if there's an image on here somewhere, but yeah, when there's an image, you can like drag an image by default. That's like a default behavior, and I can either drag it to a new tab or I can drag it to the current address bar, and it'll paste in the address of that. So I can hit enter and I can actually see that. Or in that case, I'd probably drag the link. You can also drag links if there's anchor tags around. So if I want to open support in a new tab, I just drag it up here. So anchors and images have some default functionality when you drag them, but most things do not. And certainly list items don't have a default functionality. Like if we just undo that and hit save, when I try to drag this, it's selecting, right? That's the default behavior. It's actually selecting text, because anytime you drag over text like that, it's going to try to do a selection. But by adding draggable equals true to all of these elements, it's suddenly going to change that default behavior. But again, we have to do the magic of, hey, when you actually drag these, let's reorder the list and let's do all that good stuff that we need to do. And that means we get to create a brand new component. How exciting is that? Let's go into our JavaScript here. Again, we have our app.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to right click in JS. We're going to hit new file, and we're going to create a sortable.js, which is going to export class sortable. And we'll go ahead and save that, and we'll instantiate this inside of our app.js by importing sortable from sortable, and then we'll create an instance of sortables, const sortables equals new sortable, like so. And just like we did in our toggle class, we're going to create a constructor that's going to accept options that you can override. So we'll create a little JS doc. I'm not going to go through the trouble of doing all the JS doc stuff that we did with toggle, because that just is time consuming, and you guys have already seen how to do that. But let's just say, for example, we'll have a type definition called options, just like we did, and that'll be component configuration options, and this will return a sortable, instantiate a new sortable. And then inside of the constructor, we will do this.config equals object.assign. And then we'll have our options, which might include like an attribute and an on-sort event or something. Like we'll figure out what goes in here in a moment. But then we're going to override that with the options object that you're actually passing in up here. And then that way we can do a little JS doc for sortable component configuration type options. So again, I didn't create the type definition for that. You could certainly do that if you want to spend a few minutes to do that. You'll get some better IntelliSense and stuff whenever you set that up. And just as before, we will do this.init, which will initialize component, and we will return this. So it's going to return the instance of the sortable that's just been constructed. And then we have our init method, which is going to initialize component and return void. And inside of this is where we would register our event listeners, for example. So we could say event listeners. And let's just take a look at this, because we're not going to use the same event listeners that we used in the past, because we're now using drag and drop functionality. So if we do a global event listener like we did before, we can do document.add event listener just as before. And this type parameter, this argument that we pass in here, you'll see there's a whole bunch in here that begin with drag. And there's a lot of drag events. There's a whole bunch of other events too that we haven't really covered. We've really just looked at click and at the key down. Those are the two that we've used thus far. But there's a whole bunch for drag. So you have drag end, drag enter, drag exit, drag leave, drag over, drag start. And these are all really important when you're designing your components that deal with drag and drop functionality. You need to generally use a mix of these to say, when you start dragging, do this. When you drag over an element that is droppable, then do this. When you end your drag, meaning you release your mouse and you're dropping something in that case, then do this. And all of these drag events, these things that start with drag and drop, they all do different things. And it's important to kind of understand the intricacies of how they work. So I will give you guys a link to this in the video description down below. But if you just do a search for MDN drag drop, they have an article that talks about, in particular, all the drag events that you have, and it gives you a description and tells you about the difference between those. So on drag, it's fired with an element or a text selection is being dragged. Drag end is when the drag operation is ended by releasing mouse button or hitting escape, etc. So there's lots of intricacies between all of those different drag and drop events, and I think that's really important to kind of bookmark and make sure that you know exactly the differences between those, because it's going to be very different based on what type of drag and drop you are actually doing. But typically, specifically with a sortable, what we want to do is we want to say, when you start dragging, then keep track of what element is being dragged. So in this case, we want to say, hey, you're currently dragging tacos. And then when you drag over another sortable, another element in the list that can be sorted, we can say, oh, you're dragging downwards over burritos. So let's move burritos up and let's move tacos down. So that's kind of the drag over. And then when you drag end, meaning I release it, then we can basically stop keeping track of what are we sorting at that given time. So that's kind of the basic flow and the basic logic of this is, when the drag starts, you say, okay, this is what I'm sorting. This is the element that I grabbed. And then as you drag over each of these elements, we're going to handle the whole sorting logic. So that's where we actually move, or you sort. When you drag over, that's when you move things around. And then when you end, you can kind of stop paying attention to what it is that you're sorting and say, okay, this is the final sort. We're all done. And that means that we're actually going to need 3 different event listeners, global event listeners, inside of this init method. So we're going to use, once again, we're going to use drag start. And then we will create a method called this.start that we will pass that to. And again, we're going to do 3 of these. So we're also going to do drag over. And that's going to be the, we'll just do this.over. And then also drag end. And that'll be this.end. Like so. So we actually need to use 3 different events to handle the logic of a sortable. And again, that's very typical with drag and drop. It's not going to be like an easy like click on click do this. It's a lot more complex than that, because you're dragging things around, you're dragging over other things, you're dropping things, and so you kind of need to handle 3 different events, and that needs to be the way that you logically break it down in your head. And so what we can do now, we need to create these 3 methods. So we'll say start, we'll accept an E parameter. Over, we'll accept an E parameter. And end, we'll accept an E parameter. And then for our start, let's add a little JS doc. This is going to be there's a special one, I think it's called drag event. Let me make sure that's actually correct. Yeah, so we get a description here. So it gives you what's called a drag event. So let's just console.log E here. So you can kind of see what that looks like. Drag start event, drag start handler. not handler, listener. Like so. So just by adding that, we're going to console.log the drag event whenever we start dragging over something. And you'll see here, if I just kind of drag and like do stuff, like nothing's being added to the console down here. But as soon as I pick up something that is draggable, it's going to fire off a drag event. So you can see this is drag start. If you scroll way down, you can see that it has a type of drag start, but it gives me all sorts of data about the drag that is beginning. It's very similar to like a click event. So you're still going to get like positioning information. You're going to get client X, client Y, but it has this property on it called data transfer that you can actually use to like do things like drag and drop files. So you can actually have events like when you drag a file from your desktop onto some element, it'll actually have some data transfer that's really interesting. We don't necessarily need that for a sortable because a sortable is all within the page. But if you are dragging and dropping files and images and stuff like that, either around in your app or even from the desktop into the web application, you can use data transfer to do that, which is pretty cool. And you also have a target, which you can see here, e.target is the list item that we picked up and we dragged. And that's actually what we want to use in the drag start event is we want to say, hey, when you start sorting or when you start dragging one of these elements, let's keep track of which of the elements it is that we actually picked up. So in order to do that, what we're going to do inside of this listener is, first of all, let's check and make sure that we actually picked up an element that we care about. Because again, you could be start the drag start event, just like a click. When we do a global click listener, we're capturing all clicks. In this case, we're capturing all drag start events. So we don't want to necessarily know when the user starts dragging an image or a link or something around. We want to make sure that in this case, they're dragging a sortable, something that we want to be sortable. So in order to do that, we could use the same method we use to filter out our clicks. So we could add an attribute. Maybe we call this data sortable. And then that's going to be the attribute for our sortable items that are inside of this component. And then in our HTML, for each of these list items here, we will add data sortable. So we'll make sure that whenever you start sorting an element, like right here, that actually has this attribute on it. Otherwise, we don't care about that drag start event. So in our sortable, now that we've done that, and we've saved that attribute name to this config.attr property, let's go down here and basically say not a sortable if e.target.matches, and then we'll do a template string that's going to contain this.config.attr. Then we'll simply return, otherwise console.log e. So again, I'm just logging the start event for now, but you'll see here if we start dragging this element, that's going to work fine. But let me just put something in here. Let me do ahref equals hashtag $, whatever you want to call it. So I just added a link. If I start dragging the link, it's not going to fire off that console log. So you see I can drag start that. We don't care about that. But if I drag start one of my sortables, let's go ahead and do whatever it is our start wanted to do in that case. We don't actually need to do this. I was just kind of demonstrating the filtering capability of this line right here. And now that we've filtered that out, let's save whatever element it is, or e.target, right? That is the element that you actually picked up and you started dragging. So let's save this and keep track of this. Now in our toggle component, the state of the component was really, really simple, right? Because it was either toggled on or it was toggled off. It was a single Boolean value, but in most of your components that you build, most likely you're going to have more complex state than that. So typically what I would do on these components is, in addition to sort of initializing the event listeners here, on the init method, we could also set a property called this.state, and then that could equal some sort of more complex JavaScript object that is going to contain the state of our component. So for example, we'll just add a JS doc here. We could just say component state type, and then you could do like a type definition called state if you wanted to. That'd probably be a good idea. We don't need to do that now. But basically, for example, in this case, we could have a state of dragging element that's going to be null by default. But whenever you start dragging, we'll go and update this.state.dragging element, and we'll set that to whatever it is that you picked up. And then that way, at any given time, whenever we're doing things inside of this component class, we can always say, hey, what is the element that you're currently dragging? We can just access this.state.dragging element, and that's going to give us that element that we picked up at the start of our drag and drop operation. And that's pretty easy to set. Now that we've initialized state in our init method up here, we can come down to our start and we'll say save dragging element, this.state.dragging element equals e.target. And this is pretty cool because now in a different listener method, like for example, whenever we end our sorting operation or our drag and drop, maybe I want to say, hey, now that you've ended this, what was the element again that we were dragging around? Well, I could say console.log this.state.dragging element. So whenever you end your operation in this case, you'll see now in the console when I pick it up, I'm going to move it around, but when I end, it's actually going to say, hey, you ended the drag, but here's the element because we saved it in the state of our component. Here's the element that you were dragging around. And even though this is in a totally separate method, I'm able to access this.state from all of my event listeners, which is important. That's what we want to do in this case. So let's take that out. We don't necessarily need to do that. But now that we have saved our dragging element, let's utilize the over method down here, which is our drag over event, to say, let's do something when you drag your element, your draggable that you picked up. When you pick up one of these sortable items and you move it over something else, let's do something. Let's resort the unordered list in this case. So let's first of all just I want to demonstrate how this drag over listener works. So let's create a little JS doc here thing that says drag over event, and this will be the drag over listener. And let's just console.log e because I want to kind of show you. Big performance risk, because just watch the console real quick. When I pick this up and I drag it, we just logged, look at all these events that were just logged. Like, it's ridiculously long. We just logged tons of events. And actually, let me just change this to console.log over so you can sort of see whenever we do this. Let me clear that, how many events that actually fires off. So if I just kind of move this around, just by that short move operation, we fired off over 2,100 drag over events. So big performance concern with drag over. You want to do things like DOM manipulation as little as possible on drag over, or you want those operations to like only be fired off every once in a while, because if you're doing stuff in drag over just in like that 1 to 2 seconds that I was dragging that around, it's going to do it that many times. So you have to be very, very careful about the performance of your drag over event. And so it's sort of the same thing as mouse move. There's a mouse move event that you can actually capture. And there's other events like resize and scroll up and scroll down that get fired off in really, really rapid succession. And you have to be very careful in your listeners when these sort of things pop up, because you need to make sure that you're as performant as possible in those methods. So first of all, one of the things we could do here is we could basically say if this.state.dragging element is falsy, then let's simply return, because we are not dragging anything, right? So if we're not dragging anything, let's just like totally ignore this event. So we'll immediately return, and Boolean checks are really, really fast, right? So that's like an okay thing to put into a drag over event. And you especially want to make sure that your Booleans are being checked first before you do other things like .matches or .contains or whatever, because those need to like search the DOM. They need to traverse the DOM, and that takes time. And that is going to be more processor intensive than a simple Boolean check like we're doing here. So in your over event, let's do any sort of Boolean checks we need to do to make sure that this is an event we care about. And then later on in the method, we can do some traversal. So in this case, what we can do is we can say when you pick up something that we care about, let's set this.state.dragging element to e.target. And then the over event, let's just put back in console.log over. That'll be fine. But then when you end down here, this is going to be a drag end event. whenever you release your mouse button, let's go ahead and clear state. So we will set this.state.dragging element back to null, so that way this drag over event, again, as long as this is a falsy value, this dragging element, then let's go ahead and leave that as null. And now you'll see here, even though it's still going to fire it off a bunch when we're dragging, we're not going to be firing it quite as much, because if I pick up an image or if I pick up an anchor tag and I'm moving that over stuff, it's immediately going to return from this method, which is good. You want to sort of have your custom code in a drag over event running as little as possible. Another thing we could do is we could use e.target inside of our over event to basically say, are you dragging over yourself? Because that's something you could do. You'll notice here, if we console.log e.target, and let's clear the console here. If I pick up the broccoli just a little bit and I kind of move it back and forth, it's actually the e.target and the drag over event is itself, right? The thing that I picked up is broccoli, and the thing I'm dragging over is broccoli. So another nice Boolean check we could do to immediately exit out of this over method would be, are we dragging over self? And if so, let's immediately return. So if this.state.dragging element is equal to e.target, let's simply return, because we don't want to do anything if you're just dragging over yourself. So let's do console.log over once again down here, and you'll notice rather than logging stuff like hundreds of times, when I'm just moving over the broccoli, it's not doing anything. So our custom code is not running at all. It's only going to run when I actually drag over something else. And you'll see immediately we've eliminated a lot of custom code running in this over event by doing a self check. And now that we've done a little bit of checks to make this more performant, now we can say, are you dragging over a sortable? Or in this case, actually, we'll say if you're not dragging over a sortable, then let's just return. Because if you're not dragging over something else in this sortable list, then we don't care about that. Like if you're dragging over this text area, let's not run any custom code then either. So this is a little bit less performant because we're going to have to use a dot matches at this point, but we've already done, again, our Boolean checks up here. So hopefully this is going to run as few times as possible. So in this case, we'll say if e.target.matches, and then we'll build a template string that's going to check for this.config.attr, like so. And so if it's not a data-sortable by default, again, we will simply return. And now you'll notice, again, if I pick up my broccoli and I'm dragging over self, we don't do anything. You don't see anything logged to the console. If I drag over anything in the window, it doesn't matter, right? It's not doing anything. It's only going to run our custom method when I'm dragging over other sortables, which is going to happen a lot less often than me just kind of dragging things willy-nilly around the page. We don't want to be firing off custom code every time I'm doing this, only when we're over something we actually care about. So that line's going to make this even more performant. And then finally, one thing you need to be careful about in your sortables is you need to consider whether or not you want this to be sortable and drag and droppable into another list. So there are patterns where you may want a sortable where you can pick this up and move it to a list that's maybe over to the right or down below, and you can actually move items between two different sortable lists, and that's certainly something you could do. I'm going to say in this case we don't want to do that just for the sake of brevity. Let's keep this simple, but that's something you need to consider as well, because all we're really doing here is we're saying, are you dragging over a sortable? We're not saying, are you dragging over a sortable that's in this list? And maybe we want to do that in this case. Maybe we want to say, let's make sure that if there are two sortables on the page, that you're actually dragging this item over the same list. And so what that's going to look like is we'll do yet another check down here, and we'll say not dragging over same list. And in order to do this, I think we're going to need to do very similarly to what we did with our toggle, where we had this idea of a toggle container that scopes all of the functionality for that toggle. In this case, what we can do is we can create a sortable container, which can be this outer div with a class of sortable. So we're going to do the same sort of thing we did with our toggle, where we will have in our options, we'll have a sortable container, which is a selector of .sortable by default. So that will be, and let me alphabetize these. I think that looks good. And so we'll go out and get our closest sortable container from the target, first of all. So let's come down here and let's say if the e.target is not in the same container as the dragging element, then let's go ahead and cancel this over event in this case. So if e.target.closest this.config.sortable container is not equal to this.state.dragging element.closest this.config.sortable container, then let's return in that case. So this would be one method to do this, is we're going to the target and we're getting its closest sortable container and we're comparing that to the dragging elements sortable container. And if that's not the case, return. This, I would say, is definitely an opportunity to improve this further. So you'll notice here, we can do this. It's still going to work fine, but you kind of notice it's a little bit skippy down here. Like it's hard to measure performance without getting into the whole performance thing and measuring frames and stuff like that and comparing apples to oranges. But in general, this is going to be a slow operation because what we're doing is once we got to this point, we already ran a dot matches, which is a potential performance concern because we have to run that every single over. And so that's not ideal, but we kind of need to check that we're dragging over a sortable, so we have to do that. But then in the very next line, we're doing a .closest, which again is a very, closest in particular, is a performance-heavy operation because it could potentially not have a closest sortable container. Like if I'm dragging this over the text area down here, it's going to go to its parent and its parent and its parent and its parent and its parent until it gets all the way out to the document, the HTML, and it's finally going to say, hey, we didn't find anything. We didn't find a closest sortable container. And then if that's the case, then it's going to go to the dragging element, and then again, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to go to its parent and its parent and its parent until it finds its sortable container. And we're kind of doing that twice on every single over operation, and that's a big potential performance issue. And so generally, if you can move traversal to a start or an end event with both drag and drop, also with mouse move and stuff like that, it's going to be more performant. So for example, in this case, if we can take this logic check and we can move it to the drag start event, it's going to make it so much faster because drag start only happens once at the beginning of a drag. So anything that's kind of performance intensive, like a .closest operation, you should really, if at all possible, make sure that it's only firing once per operation as opposed to hundreds of times. So in this case, what we could do to kind of improve this quite a bit is we could have a new state property called the sortable container or the list or whatever we want to do, and we could sort of save that so that we could use it later in the .over, but we only actually have to run the traversal once. We're saving a reference to it in the start method so that we can then reference back to it later. Sort of like we're doing with this .dragging element. It's the same sort of thing where we're just saving a reference to it so that we can use it in other methods later on. So let's go ahead and improve this. What we'll do is up here, after we get our dragging element, let's also get sortable container, and we'll say this.state.sortable container is equal to e.target.closest this.config.sortable container. So we're saving this sortable container in state. We should also make sure that when we're instantiating state up here, that is initially has a value of null. The sortable container. And also when we end our dragging operation, we want to set that back to null as well. So let's go down here to end, and we'll set this.state.sortable container is equal to null down here. And now that we've done this, whenever we're in this over operation, I know what the sortable container is. I already got it once in the start. We only had to do that once to do that traversal. And now I can simply say, if we delete all this junk, we can say if this.state.sortable container.contains e.target, and then actually what I want to say, if it doesn't contain e.target, and let's just return. So if the target that you're dragging over is not inside of our sortable container, then we don't care about it. And .contains is going to be a lot more performant because it's a much smaller subset of content. It's not a traversal all the way up to the DOM root, the HTML or the document element that could potentially go through many, many layers of hierarchy of ancestry, if you will. It's rather only searching within the scope of this sortable, which you can see isn't that many elements. So there's not really that much to sort through, and a .contains is typically going to be a lot faster than a .closest, especially if .closest could potentially not return something. So now you'll see here, it's kind of hard to tell that this actually does anything without having two sortables on the page, but you'll see I imagine if you were to measure the performance of those two approaches, this one is going to be a heck of a lot faster. All right, and now that we have done all this fun stuff with our over method, we've done all this checking to make sure that this is a valid drop target. You know, you're dragging over another sortable, you're dragging in the same list. If all that stuff is true, we're going to get down to this point in the method, and now we can finally actually handle the sorting. So maybe what we want to do in this case is instead of doing console.log, we could just say sort and this.sort with e.target. So maybe we'll just pass the target that you're sorting over, the thing you're dragging over, and we'll create a custom method that we'll create called this.sort. And let's go ahead and scroll down here. After our end method, we'll create a sort, which will accept a target. And so this is going to be HTML element target, and that is the target over which the current draggable is held. And this will order the sortable list. Return, I guess this will return void. Return void, like so. And basically the logic for how this sort method is going to work is we want to take the current draggable and we actually want to remove current draggable from the UL. Right? So first of all, let's take it out. So when you drag over something else, let's remove the current draggable, and then let's add current draggable back to the UL at a different position. That's essentially what we want to do in this sort method. And the different position is going to be based on the target, which is in this element, right? This is telling us what we're dragging over, and that's essentially what we want to do. Now, in order to do removal of the element from the unordered list, what I actually want to have in our state, it would be really nice to have a reference to our list, which again, for performance reasons, because this sort is potentially going to run a lot because it's being called from the .over method in this class. I think it would be good to go ahead and do some traversal to get our unordered list, but I want to make sure that that traversal is only going to happen once in our start method. So let's go back up to our start method, and yet again, what we're going to do is sort of like we got the sortable container. Let's go ahead and get a reference to the sortable list itself, and also save that to our state. So we can probably do this right after save dragging element. We'll save sortable list. And so that, and generally with a sortable, sortables are list items in an unordered list. So I don't even know that we need to do a special selector here. We can just get the sortable's parent, right? I think that'll be the easiest thing to do. So we can say this.state.sortable list, which is equal to e.target.parent element. So we want to get the target's parent element, and that's going to be this state variable we're calling sortable list. And we'll save a reference to that again in the start method because this is traversal. So we want to make sure that's really, really fast, and we'll do that once in the start method. Let's come up here and let's add sortable list as null inside of our state, and then we'll also set that back to null on end. So this.state.sortable list is equal to null whenever we end our drag operation. And now that we've saved our sortable list inside of our sort method, we can remove current draggable from the ordered list. So we can say this.state.sortable list.remove child. So there's a method called remove child that you can run on an HTML element, which is going to be what our sortable list is. And basically you just tell it, you give it a reference to that HTML element, which we already have through this.state.dragging element. So we're going to remove the thing that we're currently dragging from the sortable list, which is the unordered list. And then next we're going to add it back, but we're going to add it after the target that we're dragging over. And we can do that using target.insert adjacent element. So you see right there, there's a custom method that basically takes a position and then the element itself. This is really handy for adding elements before or after the target in this case. And so first of all, our position, there's a couple different positions, and there's an article on MDN that describes this, but basically we would either want to do after end or before begin, but that's going to do before and after respectively. So let's do, in this case, we want to add it after the end of this element. And the element that we're going to add is this .state.dragging element. And actually we'll want to reset the reference to our dragging element because technically insert adjacent element creates a whole new element. So at that point, your this.state.dragging element will reference an element that was technically removed. So what we'll want to do is make sure that we reset this variable to reference the new element that was creating and not the old one that was removed. So we'll simply set this.state.dragging element to equal target.insert adjacent HTML. And then I think that's going to be it. Let's test this out, and we will come in, we will pick up our tacos, and you'll see we are dragging it up and down. That's pretty cool, right? And actually what's really cool about this is because we're doing the sort, but we're also checking to make sure you're not dragging over yourself. Let's look at just how few times, if we do console.log over, look how performant this is and how few times it actually has to run. Let me clear console there. If I drag up, you'll see it's running, but even though I resorted that like several times before, it would do, like if I held it down for a few seconds, it would do like 2,000 times. It's actually doing it a lot less in this case, just because I'm doing the check to make sure you're not dragging over self. And whenever you're sorting, the self is actually going to be under you a lot because you're seeing how I'm kind of moving it around, and then that counter stops going up. In those cases, which is going to be nice. So it is generally going to be more performant once you actually get the sorting working, because you're often going to be dragging over self, which will eliminate that from running quite a bit. And you can see we've now added the ability to drag up and down. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so I think that's going to do it for this episode. We've done a very basic sortable at this point, and we've implemented it using HTML5's drag and drop events, which are very, very handy to not just do sortables, but to do all sorts of other components you may want to be doing. And this is a pretty cool feature you can add to any application to create this sortable functionality. We certainly have a bit of a ways to go, however. There's a couple features that I want to improve on this sortable. So in the next lesson, we're going to come back and see how we can further improve this and add some cool new stuff to our new component that we've built.